The Carolina grant, for instance, was given to a group of 8 loyal noblemen who envisioned creating a quasi-feudal society in the New World. Under the system they proposed, Carolina would have a well-defined aristocracy of large landholding nobles who would farm their estates with serf-like tenants and slaves. Common freemen would be allowed to vote, but the popularly elected assembly would remain subordinate to the lord proprietors. This vision largely failed to be realized, as few ordinary settlers wished to live under those sorts of conditions. To attract colonists, the lord proprietors were forced to make concessions, giving more political and economic power to ordinary folk. Over time, there also developed a sharp distinction between the northern and southern parts of the colony. While North Carolina was thinly settled, mostly by settlers coming out of places like Virginia, South Carolina grew much more rapidly, in part because of an influx of people from the British possessions in the West Indies. By this time, the British West Indies, particularly Barbados, had become economically quite successful, based upon the growing of sugar with slave labor. The available land, however, was exhausted, leading landless younger sons of the West Indies planters to seek their fortunes elsewhere. Many came to South Carolina, bringing with them the institution of slavery. They grew indigo, a highly prized dye, but even more importantly, they grew rice. Ironically, their success in growing this crop stemmed in no small part from the agricultural expertise of Africans held in bondage, since rice cultivation, which was unknown in England, was common in Africa. The second great proprietary grant given out by Charles II was New York. This region was originally part of the Dutch colony of the New Netherlands, founded in the early 1600s by the Dutch West India Company. Although primarily interested in trading with the natives for furs, Dutch settlers also arrived in the region and established themselves in the Hudson River Valley, along the Delaware River, and in the city of New Amsterdam. New Netherlands was characterized, like Holland, by a broad religious tolerance, and the population itself was ethnically very mixed, with the Dutch representing only about half the colonists. The West India Company also sought to develop the region with patroonships. Under this system, huge land grants were given to patroons, who exercised many of the same powers given to feudal lords, such as the right to establish courts. They hoped to work these estates with farmers who would rent their land from the patroons. As we saw in the British colonies, this effort to plant an elitist feudal society in the New World largely failed. Beginning in the 1650s, the British fought a series of wars with the Dutch, in part to determine who would be the dominant commercial power in the world. In 1664, the British captured New Netherlands, and the king, Charles II, granted the territory to his brother, the Duke of York, who would later become King James II. James agreed to continue Dutch policies of broad religious tolerance, but he had no real interest in allowing the colonists any political power. Unlike most other English colonies of this time, there was no elective assembly in New York. This ultimately did change in 1683, when it became apparent that few English immigrants wished to settle in a colony which offered them so few political liberties. James reluctantly agreed to the formation of a representative government. The third colonial grant given out by Charles II was to Sir William Penn. Penn, like the other recipients of proprietary grants, was a member of the English aristocracy, but he differed from the other proprietors in one key respect. Penn had joined a religious group that called themselves the Society of Friends, also referred to as Quakers. The Friends' beliefs were, for that time, quite radical. They believed in religious tolerance, nonviolence, and the absolute equality of souls, and they carried this emphasis upon equality into the social realm as well. They refused to recognize social distinctions such as titles of nobility, and instead referred to everyone simply as friend. In their services, they had no clergy. Anyone could preach, including women. Penn was determined to create in his new colony of Pennsylvania a society which reflected these values. Religious tolerance was guaranteed, and Penn created a system of government which ensured the civil liberties of the colonists and their right to an elected assembly. Penn also sought to live peacefully with the natives of the region, negotiating with them to purchase their land rather than seizing it from them in war. Because of these policies, Pennsylvania attracted large numbers of European settlers, and became one of the most ethnically and religiously diverse areas of the English colonies.